There have been a lot of tier list videos made about Hypixel Skyblock, with many of them focusing around one game mechanic: pets. Pets are one of the most important parts of the game, with having a maxed pet menu being one of the main goals of many players. In today's video, I will be doing my own take on this concept, ranking each pet from F to S+. Before we get into it, I want to lay down a few ground rules for this tier list. The first of those rules is a large portion of why I actually wanted to make this tier list, and that is that I will be ranking all pets at level 100 at their highest rarity, which does include the 3 mythic pets. All of my pets here are level 100 and with the proper pet items on them, meaning that none of these are tier boosted or anything like that. I will also be including the Grandma Wolf, except because you can't take the Grandma Wolf out of the pet menu, I've decided to use a recombobulated recombobulator instead. The next thing I want to mention is that I will be ranking these from F to S+, with F being pets that are basically entirely useless and have no practical purpose, and with S+ being the best pets in the entire game. Rule 3 is that I will be comparing these pets with disregard to their cost. I'm not going to care about how expensive something is, but this isn't going to be a guide to which is going to be the best bang for your buck. The last and most important rule for everybody to understand is that all of these are my opinion. This is not a definitive right or wrong. This is what I personally think and is also heavily biased based on how I enjoy playing the game. Now that we have all of that out of the way, let's get right into the video. Before we actually get into doing the tier list itself, I want to explain my leveling system and also how I'm going to be going through and ordering all of them. So first things first is that it is F through S+. Most of them will be considered F through S, with a very select few being in the S+ range. However, the F is mostly pets that are entirely useless. D are going to be pets that are mostly useless but maybe have a single use that isn't that good. C is going to be pets that are sort of just all around okay and sort of not really useful in any case because they mostly get outclassed. B is going to be pets that are starting to be useful but still are mostly outclassed and sometimes will have 1 or 2 things that they're the best at. A is mostly going to be pets that are very good and are the best at what they do. It's just that what they do isn't quite as good as the S tier, which is going to be the top of the top and really the best pets in the game. In terms of actually ranking the pets themselves, I'm mostly just going to be going in the order that they appear in the pet menu. However, there will be a few times where I'll get to a pet and then I'll pull out another pet to rank them together. Most of the time when I do that, it'll just be things to make my explanations more succinct and so I don't have to explain things multiple times in a row. With that out of the way, let's get into our very first pet rating, which of course will be the Mythic Bat. In my opinion, the Mythic Bat is a very good pet. However, it has a very limited use case, which is of course only the spooky event. However, in the spooky event, it's really, really good, so for that reason, I'm probably going to put it at a high B, or I might consider it to be a low A in some circumstances. The next pet up is going to be the Mythic Enderman. However, there are actually going to be 3 pets that I'm going to rate together, and those are going to be the Mythic Enderman, the Tarantula, and the Wolf. Of course, these 3 pets all buff combat XP, with the Enderman and the Tarantula buffing combat XP by 40% for their specific types, and the Wolf buffing it by 30% for all combat XP. However, these aren't really S tier pets in my opinion, because in general, while you're leveling combat, you want to be leveling another pet to sell alongside it. However, because of the Enderman and all of them being useful for Slayer in particular, I would still say that most of these are A tier. In my opinion, the Enderman is by far the best of these 3, probably being up in the high A range. After that, the Wolf follows somewhat close behind it, but really isn't quite as good because Fens of course aren't as insane, and nobody really uses it for many things in general, and the Terra is quite a bit worse because, once again, Tarantula Slayer is not that useful in general. Next up in the pet menu is the Jerry pet. The Mythic Jerry really does have basically no use at all, and even though it does have a perk that can be useful, nobody really uses it ever, so I'm pretty sure everybody will agree that this goes in the F range. Of course, you could say that it's in the S+ because it's like funny or something, but in my opinion, Jerry isn't funny, so you will go down in the F range. The next pet in the pet menu is our first legendary pet, and that is going to be the Baby Yeti. The Baby Yeti is going to be rated alongside with the Blue Whale, which are both very good tank pets, but have different pros and cons. While both of them can be very useful for tank stats in general, the Blue Whale just sort of outclasses the Baby Yeti when it comes to raw tank stats. And because the Blue Whale is very good for tank stats, I'm probably going to be putting it as a low range A. However, the Baby Yeti is sort of just not the best at anything. It's good in lower floors of dungeons if you can't get something better and you can't survive the lower floors, and it's good for Enderman's Lair if you can't afford an Ender Dragon. However, because it's not the best at anything in particular, it probably deserves a mid-tier B. The next pet up is the bee, and it doesn't really have any useful perks and isn't really good for anything, but it isn't entirely useless as some of its perks can do some things, so that means I'm going to be putting it in the D range. It's very bad, but it also wouldn't be literally negative to use like the Jerry pet would. After that is arguably the best pet in the game, which is the black cat. Of course, in my opinion, the black cat is going to be an S+, but I want to explain why first. First of all, it is the best pet in the game for Magic Find, except for when you have a Chimera 5 Daedalus Axe, which applies to only about 4 or 5 people. It also happens to be the best pet in the game for pet luck, and is the only pet in the game that can increase your speed cap. Also, because it increases speed and the speed cap, it works really well with the Warden helmet, meaning that it's even better. Also, finally, it's extremely powerful for clearing in dungeons as a mage because it increases your speed cap. This puts it probably as being the best pet in the game, up there with one other, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. The next pet is the Blaze, and the Blaze really isn't that useful despite its extremely impressive stats. In general, the Blaze pet is only useful if you have frozen blaze armor, or you're in the Blazing Fortress, neither of which are very meta things to do these days. The one instance in which it can actually be useful is crafting pets, as if you go to the Blazing Fortress, it can even outclass the Black Cat in terms of pet luck. However, this really isn't that useful anymore because crafting pets isn't much of a money-making method these days. In general, I would just say that it's not that useful, and I would probably put it as a mid-tier C. Next up is the Chicken Pet, which I will be rating alongside the Magma Cube Pet, the Pigman Pet, and the Spider Pet. The thing that connects all 4 of these relatively strange pets is that all of them buff different types of specific minions when you're on your island with them. The Chicken Pet buffs chicken minions, the Magma Cube Pet buffs slime minions, the Pigman Pet buffs pig minions, and the Spider Pet buffs spider, cave spider, and tarantula minions. All 4 of these pets also do have other abilities, but for most of them, they aren't really that powerful. The only one that's arguably good is that the Pigman Pet also buffs your damage by 25% against mobs level 100 and up, but most of the time this is just outclassed by other damage pets. That means, in my opinion, the only things that we really care about are going to be the minion speed buffs, which are very much different for each of them. The Spider is arguably very good because tarantula minions are extremely good for money. However, it's still not that insane, and it's only an AFK pet, meaning that it's probably a high tier C. The next up is going to be the Pigman Pet, which is pretty bad. However, its redeeming quality is that its damage ability can be pretty useful, so it's also going to be in the C range. The Magma Cube Pet is pretty worthless. Slime minions are basically entirely useless these days, so it's going to go in the D range. And now this one will be pretty surprising, and that is the Chicken Pet. Most people tend to say that chicken minions are pretty useless, however that's not really true, because contrary to popular belief, as far as I know, chicken minions are better than melon minions for farming XP, meaning that the Chicken Pet can be very good for AFK farming XP. However, the problem is that a lot of people will spend a ton of time on their island farming with a rabbit pet while they're trying to level up farming, and not using the Chicken Pet, which would make the chicken minions better. This means that although it is very good, it's probably still only in the mid-tier B range. The next pet up is going to be the Dolphin. However, along with the Dolphin, I am going to be rating all pets that you use specifically for skill grinding. In total, there are 9 of these pets, with some skills having multiple pets assigned to them. They are the Dolphin, Flying Fish, Squid, Silverfish, Mithril Golem, Ocelot, Monkey, Rabbit, and Guardian. To make it a little bit clearer, I separated them out into a couple different categories. The bottom row is all of the pets that are primary for skill XP grinding, and what you would say are really the best for each skill. However, above them, there are pets that can assist with these skills, or can have alternate use cases. I'm going to start with the worst of the pets on this list, and it will contrast the rest of them, because in general, I would say that all of these pets are very, very powerful, except for the Guardian, and that is for one reason in particular. Enchanting isn't really a skill that takes much time at all, so by making it go faster, you're not really taking less time, you're decreasing how much money it costs. This is where the problem of the Guardian arises. By using a Guardian, you make it go 30% faster in terms of skill XP, meaning that it'll cost you 30% less. However, you could also just use a separate pet during that time, level it up, and then sell it back for profit, which will normally offset the cost better than the Guardian will. Also, the Guardian really doesn't have any redeeming abilities, meaning that this pet is probably a low tier C. In my opinion, it's just not very good for many things in general, despite its relatively powerful ability. The next pets here are going to be a little bit difficult to categorize, because in general, I'm not going to say which skill is definitively better than the rest. However, I will say that all of the main skill grinding pets will be S tier. The way that I've oriented them here is only because of my personal bias, and in general, all three of these pets are very powerful for their respective skills. However, now that begs the question of what to do with the rest of these. The difference between these two and these three is that these two are only useful on their own, and they are both very powerful. In my opinion, the Silverfish probably goes somewhere down here, and the Mithril Golem, because of its also other very powerful abilities, probably goes at the very top of the S tier. While these three are good in their respective abilities, they aren't really at their peak performance unless they're paired with the separate pet. Of course, with rod swapping, the Monkey and the Ocelot make a very powerful pair, but the Monkey really does carry it, meaning that the Ocelot goes at the top of A tier. This is a similar relationship with the Flying Fish Squid and the Dolphin. Although Flying Fish and Squid make the Dolphin a lot better, the Dolphin sort of carries the relationship, meaning that similarly they are also at the top of A tier instead of the S tier. There's also the argument that the Flying Fish is better than the Dolphin if you're in a Legion party, however you can always just pet swap and get the perks of both. One could also say that the Squid is the best because if you're using minions, this is the only one that matters. However, in my opinion, that's a little bit weird because most of the time if you're using fishing minions, you want to level a fishing pet to offset the cost. Now that we're done with all of that mess, we can get on to the next pet, which is the Elephant. You could argue that the Elephant should have been grouped in with the rest of those. However, in my opinion, if you're just going for skill XP, which is what I was talking about, you never really want to use the Elephant pet. In my opinion, because farming is never really a top tier money-making method, the Elephant can never really be a top tier pet. In my opinion, it doesn't really compare to the Rabbit because skill XP for farming is way better than money because there are just better ways to make money in this game. Meaning that, in my opinion, it probably goes into the top of B tier. There is the argument that lower tier or lower level elephant pets can be really good in the early game, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm only talking about level 100 legendaries, and mostly the late and end game, meaning that this pet really should just stay in the B tier for me. Next up is the Ender Dragon, which until somewhat recently was a pretty bad pet. It didn't really have much use, but with the addition of the Enderman Slayer and its use in Master Mode, it has become probably a top tier pet. I wouldn't say that it's up with the skill XP pets because I much prefer skill XP to Catacombs XP, however for me it's probably in the lower end of the S tier. The Ender Dragon these days is really good, especially when it's a true Ender Dragon with the turtle helmet. Next up, we have a few pretty useless pets, with the first of them being the Endermite. The Endermite pet really isn't that good for just about anything, however it does have a few specific use cases and can make you a little bit of money, meaning that it goes in the bottom of the C tier. The next of these pretty worthless pets is the Ghoul pet, with one of its abilities just not even working and not having anything that it could apply to because Reaper Scythe zombies don't exist anymore. This pet has basically no redeeming abilities, meaning that it goes in the D tier. It's not like the Jerry pet, which is actually negative to use, similar to the Bee and the Magma Cube, it kind of just sucks. The next of these almost entirely worthless pets is the Giraffe pet. The Giraffe, once again, has basically no redeeming qualities, meaning that it also goes in the D tier. I don't think there's really much disagreement about this, and they're all pretty bad. Returning to the somewhat useful pets, we have the Golem pet. The Golem pet has some of the highest base stats in the entire game, but despite that, it's sort of fallen out of meta recently, and that's because its main use, which was dragons and other boss mobs, has sort of been destroyed because of the addition of the damage cap. This means that, in my opinion, it's probably in the very low end of the B tier. Although it is a very good damage pet, it really doesn't have a ton of use cases, meaning that it can't really ever be top tier. The next pet on this list is a sort of confusing one, and that is, of course, the Grandma Wolf. The Grandma Wolf is a very strange pet, and of course I can't even take it out of the pet menu, so I'm going to be using this reskinned Recombobulator. The Grandma Wolf really isn't that good of a pet while it's equipped. It only gives relatively mediocre stats and has no powerful abilities when it's equipped. However, despite that, I would still consider it to be one of the best pets in the entire game. Despite that, I would still consider the Grandma Wolf to be one of the most powerful pets in the entire game, and that is of course because it doesn't need to be equipped for it to be good. meaning that it's effectively pet stacking with every single other pet in the entire game. Also, the pet stacking isn't like the parrot pet, which gives you a relatively minor buff. No, it is extremely powerful and gives you a 15% combat XP buff, which can stack with the other combat XP pets. In my opinion, the Grandma Wolf is up in the S+ range just because of that fact alone. Moving past that, we get on to another very good pet, which is the Griffin pet. The Griffin pet is not only one of the best damage pets in the entire game, but can also be the best magic find pet in some very few circumstances. Not only that, but the Griffin pet allows you to participate in one of the most lucrative events in the entire game. So with all three of those things combined, I would say that the Griffin pet is in the top of the S tier. The next pet up is the horse, which I will be ranking alongside the rest of the mounts, being the skeleton horse, the pig, and the rock pet. Just by the nature of these pets being mounts and not really having many other use cases, I'm going to put all of them in relatively low tiers. First things first is the rock pet. Despite the fact that the rock does have some pretty decent stats, I would still say it doesn't have very many use cases, putting it at the bottom of the C tier. The other three pets, which do follow you around and can get in your way a ton, are arguably worse than having no pet equipped, meaning that in my opinion they're down with the Jerry pet, because there have been way too many times that I have got body blocked by a horse or a skeleton horse, and they really don't have very many use cases. The one possible use case that these three pets have is that you can use them to get through some walls. However, in my opinion, that doesn't really save them from being in the very bottom tier of this list. Next up, we have the Hound, which is a very strange pet with some pretty incoherent abilities. However, despite that, I would still consider it to be a pretty decent pet. The difficult part about rating the Hound is that while it does have some pretty decent abilities, the main use case for this pet is arguably considered to be bug abuse. The thing that this pet is really used most often for is Grim Reapers and other mobs like that, and because that's on the boundary of bug abuse, I can't give this a top tier rating. However, the rest of its abilities aren't really that bad either. The first thing to note is that the scavenger ability can make you a decent bit of money in some very select circumstances. Although it's not as powerful anymore, using a hound pet used to make you a decent bit of money off of ghosts. The finder ability really isn't that good on its own, but I'm also pretty sure that it's the ability that allows for the strange interaction with Grim Reapers to occur, meaning that it can't really be that horrible. The last ability is the attack speed ability, which of course isn't that insane, but it's also one of the very few pets in the game that gives attack speed. And so although these abilities don't really mesh together, each of them is somewhat powerful in its own right, meaning that in my opinion it probably goes in the middle of the B tier. Next is one of the few pets on this list that is directly targeted at the pure healer class, and that is the jellyfish. Most of the time healers these days will just use tank pets because while this can be somewhat useful and gives a decent amount of health, it really isn't that worth it when there are just much better pets to use. This could arguably go down in the D range, however it's not that horrible, and its next up is the lion, which for a period of time was one of the best and most commonly used damage pets in the entire game, and still can be pretty good for damage. This pet has sort of fallen out of the meta because most weapons that are trying to deal DPS won't be using first strike or triple strike anymore in favor of OFA. Also, because of the changes to sword swapping, it's pretty difficult to one-tap most boss mobs anymore, meaning that this really isn't that effective of a pet. However, it is still very good for DPS, meaning that it'll go at the top of the B tier. The lion is one of the relatively few exceptions on this list, which is that it doesn't have a ton of use cases, but just its raw abilities and stats sort of puts it up in the high tier range. We now get to another extremely powerful pet, which is the Megalodon, because it buffs shark armor. No, wait, sorry, this pet is actually pretty bad. It doesn't have very many use cases, despite the fact that it does give you some decent base stats. Its abilities sort of can be okay, and you can deal 25% more damage based on the enemy's missing health, but it just really isn't that good. None of its abilities mesh together, and because Shark Scale Armor isn't a DPS set, it won't ever really be top tier. Despite that, I would love to be proven wrong about this pet. In my opinion, the Feeding Frenzy would be really interesting to use if they got rid of the speed cap on it or something like that, and they allowed it to stack up to some crazy high speeds. I'm also going to throw in this screenshot now just in case they end up buffing it in the future, because I want to prove 2N wrong in case that happens. Despite the Megalodon's seemingly decent abilities, it just doesn't really have many uses and kind of gets outclassed by basically every other DPS pet in the game, meaning that in my opinion it probably goes in the bottom range of the C tier. I'm not exactly sure where to put it relative to the Blaze pet, but I would probably say that it's worse because the Blaze does have some use cases for pet luck. I know that I said I would exclude cost for this video, however this pet's entire purpose is basically just to decrease the cost of one thing, and that is God Pots. Despite that, it does an exceptionally poor job at this, and it takes a long time to pay off, and the math on it works out like this. If a God Pot costs around 500k, and the parrot increases the length of the God Pot by 20%, that means on each God Pot you're effectively saving 100k. The cheapest level 100 legendary parrot costs 21 mil, meaning that you would have to eat 210 God Pots for it to pay itself off. While most other pets I don't really care about their cost, this one is pretty ridiculous and would cost just an absolutely ludicrous amount of time to pay off, and it doesn't really have any other redeeming abilities. It gives you a little bit of crit chance and can boost regular potion duration by 40%. However, for most people that just don't use regular potions anymore, this really won't do much, meaning that it probably has to go into the D tier. Next up is the Phoenix, which has a pretty unique problem, being that most of its abilities are just replicated in the cookie buff. There are very few cases in which the Phoenix pet can be any sort of use, with the one exception arguably being dragons. I've heard that the Phoenix pet can be somewhat decent for dragons, but I'm also pretty sure that it just gets outclassed in most circumstances. However, this pet does have some very, very high base stats, having the highest base intelligence of any pet in the game. Although I would love to put it in a higher tier only off its base stats alone, it really just isn't that useful, and it kind of gets outclassed by basically everything, meaning that it should probably go in the C tier range along with many other pets that get outclassed in a lot of things. Next up is the Rat pet, which has some very confusing abilities. It has some very good base stats, giving you 50 strength and 100 health. However, its abilities are sort of what make it super cool. Its third ability has the chance to double drops from many things, meaning that you can get 2 times Baby Yetis just for existing, meaning that it has to sort of be in the upper range of the B tier, just because of the fact that it can double your money basically for free. It does feel sort of wrong to put it above the Baby Yeti, and so I'd kind of like to tie it with it, but I can't do that. I'll put it there for now, and I might have to do a little bit of reshuffling at the end. Next up is the Sheep pet, which used to be the best mage pet in the entire game, but has since sort of fallen out of fashion. The strange part about the Sheep pet is that it works really well for early game mages, however, most of the time you would prefer to use something that can give you a little bit more tank stats to survive in the early floors. Similarly, it can be extremely useful for very endgame mages with Chimera Hyperions, but that is a very, very small portion of the player base, and it still really isn't that insanely good. If I were making this tier list like 7 or 8 months ago, the Sheep pet would definitely be at the top of the rankings. However, these days, most of the time, people will clear with something like a Black Cat, or use a Baby Yeti or a Blue Whale or an Ender Dragon for the tank stats. While it does get mostly outclassed by the Baby Yeti for most things, because of the fact that it works extremely well with Chimera, I feel like I sort of have to put it at the bottom tier of the A range. Next up is the Skeleton, and I'm also going to be rating the Skeleton alongside the Snowman pet because both of them are useful for shooting projectiles. However, neither of them are actually that useful because sort of all they do is shoot projectiles. The Skeleton is most certainly more useful than the Snowman only because of the fact that it is useful for early game archers who can't afford Ender Dragon pets, meaning that the Skeleton pet probably goes at the bottom of the B tier. The Snowman pet is pretty useless for just about everything, meaning that it probably has to go in the D range. All it does is shoot snowballs really, and that can't ever be that useful. Next up is the Spirit pet, which is a kind of conflicting pet for me. None of its abilities are very good, however it does have the perk that the Grandma Wolf and the Parrot share, which is that its abilities are active even when the pet itself is not active. Despite that, it really does only have one useful perk, which is Half-Life, which of course gives you 1 more death possible per dungeon run, which can be nice, but in my opinion, it only is just a convenience, and it can't ever be in the top tiers. I ended up shuffling around a couple pets at the bottom of the C tier, so I could have some space to slot this guy in. In my opinion, because it's never really a pet that you're going to equip, and its abilities aren't that useful, so it's not really considered something like the Grand Mal Wolf. It has to go in the bottom of the C tier. We're getting very near to the end of the list, and the next pet up is the Tiger Pet, which used to be one of the best pets in the entire game, but now has fallen out of fashion like many other pets have. The only real use case for the Tiger Pet is in boss mobs like dragons, arachne, and horsemen. And although it is very good for that, it just doesn't ever have a use, because most of the time doing those bosses doesn't actually make money, but rather loses you money. Despite that, the Tiger Pet is still the very best at what it does, and any build that focuses around ferocity would not be complete without the Tiger, meaning that it probably goes in the middle of the B range. If super heavily ferocity focused builds do ever end up coming back into the meta, this will immediately jump to the very top tiers. However, for now, that just really isn't that useful. Next up, we have the Turtle Pet. The Turtle Pet has fallen victim to one of the classic problems with many pets these days, which is that one of its abilities just got overridden by the pet item, the Turtle Shellmet. For a long time, the legendary turtle was one of the few pets that could give you knockback immunity. However, these days, a lot of pets do because of the Turtle Shellmet, meaning that it's just sort of fallen out of fashion. Although it does give you a lot of defense, that almost entirely gets outclassed by the Blue Whale, and so there are very few cases in which you actually use a Turtle Pet. The Turtle Pet gets outclassed by basically every single other tank pet in the entire game, meaning that it has to go either in the bottom of C or, for me, in the upper range of D. We only have 2 pets left, with the first of them being the Wither Skeleton. In my opinion, the Wither Skeleton still is one of the better pets in the entire game, just because of the fact that it is very good for DPS and still has use cases in Floor 7. The main problem with the Wither Skeleton is that not many people do Floor 7. Master Mode sort of just outclasses it, however, there are still people who do Floor 7 for the money, meaning that because it helps make a lot of money, I have to put it somewhere in the bottom of A. Of course, its third ability is still somewhat useful, but really the first 2 are what make it super good, and so of course it's going to go in the bottom of A, and I would like to tie it with the sheep as sort of the 2 pets that used to be really good for dungeons, but have since been outclassed. The last pet on this list also happens to be one of the very worst, and that is the zombie. There are basically no uses for the zombie these days, and none of its abilities are good for just about anything, meaning that it probably has to sit in the D range with the rest of the pretty useless pets. And with that, my tier list is complete. I ended up condensing them all and then removing the item frames at the end, and I feel like this arc sort of means that I did a decent job. This tier list is 100% by no means perfect. It is a very difficult thing to categorize when you're comparing pets that have very different abilities and entirely different use cases. Once again, like I said at the beginning of the video, this tier list is very much conformed to my biases and how I enjoy to play the game. If you want to go around and play with this tier list yourself, I'll be linking a website in my Discord server where you can do exactly that, and then you can share your results and discuss them with other people. I also recommend you join because we do tons of giveaways and also have some pretty chill events, and I really do like interacting with my community. If you do disagree with this tier list, I would love to hear about it in the comment section below. But with that, I'll see you guys later, and adios.